high school for girls, and then an undergraduate at Oxford University reading English. However, the latter was a close-run thing, she said, actually. If you turn to the author's note in The Mistletoe Bride, it reads, "When I was little, my parents had a book called Folklore, Myths and Legends of Britain, published by the Reader's Digest in 1973 at a black cloth cover and so on, a cornucopia of stories that had endured for 2,000 years. I was so entranced with the book, I flirted with the idea of applying to read folklore studies at university instead of English. What can I say? My parents sensibly took no notice.
No offence, obviously.
And the moment passed. And yet.
And yet.
And yet. So a few years later, here we are, and yet talking about folklore, fairy tales, and comedies. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And you're welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and see so many of you on a, when they said it's 5:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, I thought, really? Well, it'd be me and a couple of people in the cafe, but it's great to see so many of you here. As Bill said, I think for all of us here, and I just quite like to do a straw poll, who in this room are writers as well as readers? Are there other? Yes, there we go. And I'm not going to say who's a reader, because if you don't put your hand up, there is the door. But I think for all of us, there is one particular thing that matters when we're writing a story. For some people, it will be dialogue, that they know they want to write a story that is driven by characters talking to each other. For some people, it will be a piece of personal family history, a letter that they've got, or a chest that was handed down from family to family, and now you've opened it up and inside there are photographs and you think, that's the story I'm going to tell. For other people, it's a place or a particular moment in history, or the idea that they want to write the continuation of what happened when Mr. Darcy and his Liza actually had to live together for the next 60 years. Did they actually get on? So there are all sorts of different things that inspire a novelist or a short story writer or a playwright or a poet to write. For me, it's landscape. That's the thing, first and foremost. And it's that idea that if you build a stage set for your characters, then the characters and the story will come. So, as Bill said, I had no idea that I wanted to be a writer, but I spent all of my free afternoons when I was young, living in Fishbourne, curled up in an armchair when I wasn't supposed to be anywhere else. And I read the folklore, the Reader's Digest book of folklore, myths and legends from cover to cover. Now, I realised when I published The Mistletoe Bride and Other Stories that lots of people had that book. Has anybody in this room got that book as well? Philip has got the book, a few other people have got the book. And it was just one of those extraordinary things where somebody had put together all these different folklore and legends of all of the British Isles. And when the Mistletoe Bride stories came out, because I talked, as Bill said, about having read this book and how inspiring it was for me, one of the editors, who is now in his late 90s, wrote to me, and he said, I am so thrilled to think that there was somebody reading that book, and 30, 35, 40 years later, the stories that he and his colleagues had collected have been the inspiration for a set of stories. But of course, that's why all of us as writers go out and about, because there will be people here who will have read something or will be talking to somebody here who might go home and write a story based on it. And that's the thing that lies at the heart of any storytelling, whether you publish it or not, that the thing that makes us us is that since the beginning of human beings standing up on their hind legs, people sat round campfires and told stories and listened to stories. And so for me, the landscape of my childhood was the thing that was the most inspiring trigger to my imagination. But I had to go away before I could see it. So here in Chichester, a Chichesterian, and there are some people who've known me a very long time, and there are members of my family here who've known me even longer. Here in Chichester, and I feel very strongly rooted to Chichester, we are in what is now the university, and a wonderful university it has become. In my day, it was Bishop Otter, and this is the place that I realised that I didn't look old enough to get into the discos. So I have many times been turned away from discos there, which is now the theatre. And my mother-in-law did her teacher training here, and it was a place that was always part of my childhood. But here in Chichester, I was always somebody's daughter, and then somebody's friend, and then somebody's pupil, and somebody's sister, and then later somebody's girlfriend, and somebody's mum, and somebody's wife, and somebody's employer. The word writer came about 20th on the list. And it was only going to a place called Carcassonne in the southwest of France in 1989 with the same mother-in-law who was here doing her teacher training. And we only were there because Granny Rosie, as she's known to everybody in Chichester, had got a friend who was an estate agent in Emsworth. And this estate agent was twinned with an estate agent in a place called Carcassonne. And that's the only reason we went there. But when we first stepped off the train and we walked down through the modern town, the 14th century town, and we got to the Pont Vieux that goes over the River Aude, and I looked ahead and saw for the first time on the hill there this incredible fortified medieval city of Carcassonne, and I fell in love. It was a coup de foudre. And more than that, I thought, oh, I belong here. And of course, over the years, I realised two things. Firstly, the reason that I understood it so well was because it reminded me of Chichester. Because it had all the same things. It had incredible landscape, it had hills, and it had water. It had a sense of history. Everywhere you go in Carcassonne, as you do in Chichester, there is the sense of the shadow of the past. There it is a bloody shadow. Here it is relatively benign, because even though the Civil War did hit here, it didn't hit that much compared to some places. And so, but you walk here in the sense of the Georgian town and the Roman town, and there in Carcassonne, you walk there with the sense of the 19th century industrial town and the medieval city on which it's built. And once I was there, because nobody knew me, I was just another English person on a holiday. There, for the first time, characters, I suppose, but just ideas, could come up and tap me on the shoulder. And I started to be able to hear stories in the landscape. And then little by little, I started to realise that through the history of the Cathars, a group of heretical Christians who lived and died in that part of France in the 11th, 12th and 13th century, I suddenly realised that I had a story to tell. And so over that period of time, and when we come to questions, I answer any questions about the big history books, but today we're here to celebrate folklore and legends and us in Sussex. But over the time, the first novel was published, Labyrinth, and that is a love letter to Carcassonne and its medieval past. And then I realised I wasn't quite done. So then I wrote Sepulchre, which is a fin de siècle novel, and that builds on, amongst other things, tarot cards. And then finally I knew that I had to finish the story, and the finishing of the story in Carcassonne is Citadel, and that is the occupation of Carcassonne between 1942 and 44 during the Second World War. And when I had finished that, that was 25 years of living partly in Carcassonne, dreaming about those stories, writing stories out of that landscape. I suddenly realised that I was ready to come home and write about home. And so Citadel, because it was Second World War and because it tells the story of an all-women's resistance unit, the research for that was very haunting. The only books that I had to go on were the books that had been written by women resistance who had survived, and their stories were terrible. And as I got to the end of writing the book, it's the only time it's ever happened to me, I found myself actually, as I sat at my computer towards the end of that novel, I found myself weeping as I wrote, because what had to happen to the characters, I didn't want to happen to them. But when you write real history, you owe it to the people who lived and died to tell it truthfully, to not make it like the happy ending of a Hollywood movie. And so when I came out of that book, I just wasn't yet ready to go back into the archives. And so then, of course, living back here at home, enjoying being in Chichester, being part of the community, indeed being very kindly, being given an honorary degree by this university, the only one I've ever accepted, because it feels like a home thing. I started to think I would like to write something that comes from here. And so then I went back to that Reader's Digest book that I had read in Fishbourne in the 60s and 70s. And I'm going to read you a little bit from one of the stories. I'm going to mostly talk about Taxidermist Daughter, because Taxidermist Daughter indeed even mentions the teacher training college as somebody walks up the hill. But I'm not going to read that bit out, because really it's not a gripping part of the novel. Obviously, no offence to the university, but they do just walk past. And we do all love the wisteria, but you know, in a thriller, wisteria is not very frightening. So what I did with the Mistletoe Bride stories, coming out of Citadel, needing just a bit of a break, needing to have a bit of fun, I went back to my real love of folklore and legend. And for me, it is English folklore and legend, because I'm British, but of course I'm an English person. I'm a Cicestrian. And so I started off simply thinking, what were the stories? Didn't go back to the book. What were the stories that leapt out at me? And of course, one that all of you, I suspect, in this room will know is the title story, The Mistletoe Bride. And it was one of those stories. There were black and white line drawings in the book, and there was a picture of a young bride in her wedding dress climbing into an oak chest for a game of hide and seek, and the lid slammed shut, and they carry on looking for her, and Lovell, her husband, looks, and he becomes a broken man, and he carries on looking for her everywhere, and the children in the village look at him and they say, there goes the man whose wife disappeared and never came back. And of course then years later the chest is found. This is one of the versions, and the lid is opened, and there inside is the bride, a skeleton in her wedding clothes and her wedding veil. And of course it's just the most awful story, because of course you imagine being that woman in there trapped, and you imagine being him, not knowing what had happened. And there have been many, many stories inspired by this. You know, Jeanette Winterson has written one, many people have written one. But I decided that I would bookend this collection of stories with two. One, I'm just going to read you a little bit at the beginning, and one with a different sort of ending that happens at the end. Because the thing about folk tales, and we'll get there, and Bill, I feel embarrassed even giving an opinion on folk tales in front of people who really know, and you guys who read so much. But the joy of folk tales for me is that they belong to us all as stories, and they come out of place and time and landscape. And any of us can be the author of that sort of story, because folk tales are told and they're retold and they change with the times, but they also remain timeless. And why do they still work for us now? Because they speak to the very, very deep and fundamental thing in all of us that understands that love doesn't change. It doesn't matter that we are standing in 2015. People in 1015 knew what it meant to love and to grieve and to feel jealousy and to want to have revenge and to want to care for somebody else. It's the wonderful writer Joanna Trollope once said to me, the human heart doesn't really change very much, Kate. And I think that's exactly what folk tales do. They link us to people who have listened to stories thousands of years before us, but we still understand them because the things that matter stay the same. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the first of the stories, The Mistletoe Bride. I hear someone coming. Have they caught the echo of my footsteps on these floorboards? It is possible. It has happened before. I pause and listen, but now I no longer hear anything. I sigh. As always, hope is snatched away before it can take root. And even now, after so long, I cannot account for the fact that no one ever ventures into this part of the house. I do not understand how I am still waiting after all these years. Sometimes I see them moving around below, sense their presence. Bramshill House has been home to many families in my time, and although the clothes and the styles and the customs are different, it seems to me that each generation is much the same. I remember them all, their faces alive with the legends of the house and the belief that it is haunted. Men and women and children listening to the story of a game of hide and seek. I pray that this will be the day, the end of my story. That this time someone at last will find me. But the halls and the corridors beneath me are silent again. No one is coming. And so then, as always, I'm carried back to that very first Christmas so long ago. So as you can probably see, that story is told from the point of view of the ghost. Because it seemed to me that even though we can be rational people, and if we're sitting on a terrace in the south of France with a glass of rosé, surrounded by friends, if we're asked, do we believe in ghosts, we say, no, of course not. I'm a modern person. But we all know that if we were walking on our own now through Kingly Vale, we would see stuff in those trees. And who's to say we're not right? Because the idea of every person who has walked the earth before us and who will walk the earth after us, long after we're gone, leaving an imprint, seems to me to make complete sense. And that, I think, is what folk tales do. They connect us to those things that wake us up at 3 a.m, that are not rational and are dark and are fearful, and that when the light comes we can push them away, but yet still there we are at 3 a.m, wondering what it is, just in the turn of the stair, that shadow. Did you see something move? So ghosts appear in a lot of my fiction. But with the Mistletoe Bride stories, I decided to use Sussex as my inspiration by and large. There are many places that claim to be the basis of the Mistletoe Bride story all over the place. And there are many places that claim to be, the most haunted house in Britain. You will all know Borley Rectory. There are many things, we know many of these stories. But what seemed to me more interesting was the types of stories that sprang up in certain sorts of places. And when Bill and I were talking earlier, he was kind enough to say that he particularly liked the story set in Kingly Vale. And the story I've set in Kingly Vale is a different sort of story, because it is absolutely about the folklore of the Sussex Weald. So it isn't about the imagination, the way our minds play tricks. It's more about the sense of the folklore that comes up to explain something terrible, usually to explain something terrible. And so everybody local who walks in Kingly Vale will know that there is a story that the oldest trees, the oldest of the yew trees in the heart of Kingly Vale, sprang up on the places that the Saxon defenders died defending the Sussex Weald against the Viking invaders in the 900s, and that where their blood fell, those big yew trees grew up right in the centre. And it is said that those trees are more than 1,000 years old, and it is said to be the oldest yew forest in Europe. And it is one of those places that we all know when you walk there and the wind blows through, we all can hear the stories in the trees. And so that story is told not from a point of view of the trees, quite, but actually it is the idea, any of you who, like me, I'm sure love Lord of the Rings, there's a bit too much Ent discussion, I have to say, but the idea that the trees are looking down and thinking, these people, they are a sorry, sorry race that are burning everything and spoiling everything and ruining everything. And so I love Kingly Vale, so I wanted to write a story there. And the last story I'm going to mention to you is, I suppose, a way of saying how, for me, stories work. And I write plays, and I write short stories, and I write very long novels, and I write quite short novels, and I write non-fiction. And short stories and plays have some more in common than novels and short stories have. For any of you who are writers, I don't know if you feel this, in that when you're writing a novel, it is your job to create the whole world. That is your job. So that where any of you pick up the book, everything you need from a story by me is in between those pages. You don't have to go and get a dictionary or go and check something on the internet. It's there. The whole world of the novel and the characters and their stories is right there. A short story, like a play, is about a moment. Not the whole world at all, but just one moment of emotion or a happening. And so one of the stories in the book is called On Harting Hill. And it's inspired by a very classic sort of ghost story legend tradition, that of the sort of phantom hitchhiker. It's a particularly popular form of ghost story in America. And we all know how it goes. You know, you're driving along one night and then you pick somebody up and they get into the back of the car, and then when you turn around, they've gone. And you go to the place and you get there and they say, no, what? No, Mary died 10 years ago. And it's usually on an anniversary, and it's a very classic form, and I was deliberately trying to do some of the classic forms. But for me, the inspiration for the story, it's set in the 60s, it's a man, he's quite sad, his marriage has broken up, he's driving down the old Portsmouth Road to weekend with some friends in Harting. And he's driving along, and he goes up Harting Hill, and I expect most people have done that journey back from London late at night up Harting Hill this time of year. And he's driving along and the mist has come down like it so often does. And he goes round one of the bends and bang! He hits a girl in the middle of the road. And of course he gets out and he's terrified and he can't find her, and then there she is and she says her name and he says, I must take you back. And so she gets in the back of the car and he takes her home, and the story follows the pattern it should do, namely that the parents, no idea, and when he goes to the graveyard he finds her grave and the jacket that he had given her hanging on the corner of the grave, because it is the anniversary of her death. But the inspiration for that story was driving home in my mother's car in the 1970s, having just passed my test, no mobile phones in those days, and driving up Harting Hill. And that thing happening of, I'm in a grown-up's car. I'm not in a student car. You know, this car works. It's been serviced. There is petrol, you know. And I drive. And as I carry on driving further and further, and the mist is coming down, and as you know, many of you, there is a sheer drop on one side, and there are the sort of sentinel trees on the other side. And the fog and the mist is hanging between the trunks. And of course, then I start to see movement. And then, of course, in the movement of the mist, you start to see faces. And then you start to say, what's going to happen if I break down? Oh my God, I'm going to break down. Oh my God, there's somebody in there, and look at the mist. And you get more and more and more and more terrified, and you get to the top of the hill. And of course, it was Sussex in the 1970s. Nothing happened. Trust me, I grew up here. But anyway, I get home, and that's the end of it. You know, it's all fine. 40 years later, when I'm trying to write that story, I suddenly remember that complete ice of irrational fear inside me when I was a teenager. And then I think, there you are. That's the story. So this is why I've looped round to why landscape and place and folklore and the legends, all the stories we hear and we share and we read, you never know when they're going to come back and bite you. You never know what is going to matter to you in telling a story. And for me, with telling a story, it's never about choosing a character. It's never about choosing the story, even. It's about the sense of atmosphere and place, and the idea that you can remember an emotion, and out of one tiny emotion, an entire story can come. And out of one tiny sense of place, an entire novel can come. So, Taxidermist's Daughter, where we have now arrived at, you will be glad to know, by way of Harting Hill. When I wrote the Mistletoe Bride stories, I still wasn't ready to go back to the new big project. I just had not quite ready to go back into those archives. And I live up the way, as many of you know, and I was walking out on the Fishbourne Marshes. And I walk there because it's where I grew up, Fishbourne, and I was lucky to grow up with fabulous parents, wonderful sisters, and a lovely, you know, one of those childhoods that are nauseating to talk about, but actually some of us got them. And so if anybody tells you you've got to suffer in order to be an artist, that's because people who want to be an artist have suffered. It's all about the stories you tell. But my wonderful dad, who many of you know, had died in 2011, and it was an enormous grief for me. And the place that it was easiest to be close to him was on the landscape of my childhood, where I had walked as a child with my parents on the Fishbourne marshes, down Mill Lane, past the duck pond, out over the Three Bridges, out along the wall, and we've done all of that in my childhood in the 60s and 70s. And then I'd wandered as a rather mournful Chai High pupil, not to do with Chai High particularly being mournful, just teenagery, clutching a book, hoping obviously that people would notice how desperately unhappy I was. But obviously there was nobody on the Fishbourne marshes, so it was a really stupid place to go. But you know, I very much remember walking around doing this. You know, I rather fancied myself as Cathy, obviously, from Wuthering Heights, without all the, you know, violence and drama that comes afterwards. And then, of course, I walked there with my boyfriend. We'll gloss over that, but suffice to say he is my husband of the past 25 years, so that's okay. And then, of course, when we moved back here, I started to walk there with my own children. And then now I walk there with my dog, because my children too are grown. So I was there because it was a landscape that meant a lot to me. And little by little, I started to think of the beauty that I could see now, looking out on the landscape, and remembering the landscape I had walked on when I was a teenager, which is not the same, similar, but not the same. And then starting to imagine the landscape of earlier still. And I went right back to 1912, because 1912 was the wettest summer on record until 2012. And when I was thinking about this and grieving for my pa, I was looking out on those terrible scenes of the poor people on the Somerset levels in particular, with the land being taken back. And what I love about the Fishbourne Marshes and all the stories and folklore that goes around marshland in particular is that it is a different landscape depending on the time of day, not just the time of year. So when the tide is up and the sun is shining, it is beautiful blue water. And the prevailing wind, which as we all know is a southwesterly mostly, and it's chipping across the surface of the sea, and it's making white horses, and you can see just the tips of the reed mace and the bulrushes a bit further, and it's green, and the flint of the walls, and it's beautiful. And you turn round and you can see the trundle behind you. And when you look to the east, you see the spire of the cathedral, and when you look to the west, you can start to see all the masts of the shipping and little boats all the way down through Bosun, Chidham, and so on. But when the tide is out, and it's like now, it's a dangerous landscape. It is blustery. You could be knocked over. The mud is deep, horrible, sinking mud, and like any child brought up on Enid Blyton and Sherlock Holmes, you know everybody dies in sinking mud. It's the biggest killer of anybody, as far as I can see, is sinking mud. And I always had this, it was like, oh my God, they're going in the sinking mud. And so if you go across Fishbourne Channel, you can see those white posts, and there is a path that you can go across. But as a child, I was obsessed with stepping off the path and that I would be lost down into the marsh, as they are all in the Hound of Baskervilles in the end. But also, when it's a stormy day, the sky is purple, and the clouds are scudding across. And when the tide is out, you can see all the stains of the seaweed on the wall. And this took me back to my incredible delight in Gothic fiction when I was a student. And Gothic fiction is, if you like, the fiction of being caught between a rock and a hard place. And the rock is that nature is not our friend. The weather is not our friend. So there will be, on the one hand, storms, as Bill said, it's dark and stormy night. There will be storms, there will be floods, there will be rain, there will be fire, there will be snow. But if you run from the flood, the storm, the fire, the snow, you run into the arms of a maniac with an axe. So you have no choice. That is basically, forgive me any English tutors in this room, but that basically is Gothic fiction, rock and a hard place, that's all you need to know. And Gothic fiction started with a novel called The Castle of Otranto back in the 1760s, 70s. And a man called Walpole went to sleep and he woke up and he wrote this novel, and it had all the things that we associate with Gothic fiction. It had castles, it had evil, nasty men who were going to interfere with their wards, it had regrettably shrieking woman in white who was always passing out, quite annoying, but obviously a dashing hero who was going to come and save the day, weather, all of this sort of stuff. And then about 30 years later, Anne Radcliffe wrote a novel called The Mysteries of Udolpho, and she was the first superstar selling author. She was the J.K. Rowling of her age, and she sold thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of this. And it is the novel, those of you who love Jane Austen, the novel that Jane Austen is poking fun at in Northanger Abbey. But then came the most significant Gothic novel of all, and that is Frankenstein. And Frankenstein is one of the great novels, regardless of any category. But what does Frankenstein have? Well, of course, it has all of those attributes of hidden alleyways and laboratories under the ground and right up to Scotland, and then the most incredible ending on the ice floes. But it had the thing that makes Gothic fiction important, and which is what I set out to do in Taxidermist's Daughter, which is behind the melodrama of the weather and the lunatic with the axe, and people passing out, and nasty folklore being put into the local villages so nobody will go near because nobody wants to go in because they've heard all these rumours and superstitions and all of this sort of thing. Gothic fiction at the heart of it always has a moral question. So in Frankenstein, people think often that the book is about humankind choosing to play God. But actually the moral of Frankenstein is, what happens to us if we are not loved? At what cost do we refuse to love? Because Creature, the monster, because we all have the film in our minds rather than the novel, which is an astonishing piece of writing. The creature thinks that it will fall to him to be loved like he sees other people are loved. And when he realises that he never will be loved, he decides to destroy everything around him. And that is the moral heart of Frankenstein, for my money. And then you move forward and you think of all the novels that follow in its stead, Jekyll and Hyde, Dracula, all the way up to the present day with people like Neil Gaiman and Sarah Waters and obviously the great Daphne du Maurier. And so I had this sense as I was walking on the Fishbourne Marshes of, yes, I remember Gothic fiction and how much I enjoyed it. And wouldn't I like to have a go at writing a Gothic thriller set here? And then as this idea was going through my mind, I started to walk out on the marshes with a slightly different set of eyes on now. Not just thinking about myself and my childhood, but starting to imagine the people who might just be out of the corner of my eye, unseen now, but soon to be the characters. And then I thought, oh, I could put a house there. Just imagine how creepy that house would be right there on its own. I mean, in fact, when I did the launch in the Festival Theatre for Taxidermist's Daughter, a lovely man came up to me after and he said, you know that house, Blackthorn House, that the lead character lives in? I said, yes. He said, you know, you put that in the middle of my field. And I said, I'm terribly sorry. He said, no, I'm delighted. I've given it to everybody for Christmas. I mean, oh my God. So that is just a tiny bit about how it starts. And I'm going to read you just a little bit from the beginning before I tell you a tiny bit more of the story. And the other piece of very important Sussex folklore that is key to the book, which of course is the taxidermy side of things. Fishbourne Marshes, Sussex, Wednesday the 24th of April, 1912. Midnight. In the graveyard of the church of St. Peter and St. Mary, men gather in silence on the edge of the drowned marshes, watching, waiting. For it is believed that, on the eve of St. Mark, the ghosts of those destined to die in the coming year will be seen walking into the church at the turning of the hour. It is a custom that has long since fallen away in most parts of Sussex, but not here. Not here, where the saltwater estuary leads out to the sea. Not here, in the shadow of the old salt mill and the burnt-out remains of Far Hills Mill, its rotting timbers revealed at each low tide. Here, the old superstitions still hold sway. Skin, blood, bone. Out at sea, the curlews and the gulls are calling, strange and haunting nighttime cries. The tide is coming in fast, higher and higher, smothering the mudflats and saltings until there is nothing left but the deep shifting water. The rain strikes the black umbrellas and cloth caps of the farm workers and dairymen and blacksmiths, dripping down between neck and tie, skin and cloth. No one speaks. The flames and the lanterns gutter and leap, casting distorted shadows up and along the flint face of the church. This is no place for the living. So, it starts badly, gets worse, ends up okay. That's all you really need to know. So the story is about a young woman, Connie, and she lives on her own in Blackthorn House on the corner of the Fishbourne Marshes at the head of the creek. And something has happened 10 years ago in the past that she cannot remember, and it has ruined her father. He has taken to the bottle to try to blot out whatever it was that happened. And they live in the remains of his once famous taxidermy museum. So the house is full of glass bell jars, full of birds with their black beady eyes that follow you around the room, and their feathers that are still looking as if at any moment they would just sit up and fly at you. And something starts to happen in the village, in that graveyard at the beginning of the book, and it is clear that whatever did happen in the past is not over, and it is coming back to haunt everybody involved. And it is Duchess of Malfi levels of body count, I should warn you on this. And it was enormous fun to write. But all I had in my mind when I started was the Fishbourne Marshes, the sense of wanting to write a Gothic story, the fact that in my childhood I'd been obsessed with a museum of taxidermy. Now, how many of you have lived in Sussex for more than 30 years, say? How many of you are local? Ooh, how interesting, not as many as I thought. So, do any of you remember the Walter Potter Museum in Arundel? Yes, good. So there was in Arundel, in the 70s, a museum of taxidermy. And it was the collection of a man called Walter Potter, who was a Victorian taxidermist, and he had set up his own little museum in Bramber, just north of Brighton, when he had gone as a little boy to the Great Exhibition in the 1850s, 1851, and had come back like so many people did, full of the wonders of the world, and wanting to do things, and how do things work. Now with taxidermy, modern palates tend to think it's a bit creepy, rather macabre, a very odd thing to do, but if you try to imagine what it was like being alive in the middle of the Victorian period, when suddenly there was this hunger to know how things worked. How did bodies fit together? Why did muscles do this and bones do that? And taxidermy was part of that curiosity, part of that explosion of science and investigation. And of course also, on this slightly lighter side of things, there were no photographs. And so although it is obviously illegal to stuff your relatives, it was not illegal to stuff your cat. And it was the way of remembering your cat. So taxidermy was incredibly important for several reasons. The third reason was that it was the great working class craft. And as such, it was never respected properly, which is why collections like Walter Potter's have gone to private collectors and are not in the V&A, which is where they should be, or the Natural History Museum. But that's another story. Anyway, back to the idea of nothing happening in Sussex in the 60s and 70s. Many of you who are my age and above will remember that in the old days, of a Sunday in Sussex, you could go to church, you could go to the Millstream at lunchtime, but only between 12 and 2:30, and you could go to a museum. That was it. You know, things were not open all the time. And I was obsessed with this museum. And so every weekend I would say to my parents, could we please go and see Walter Potter's stuffed animals? And it's only writing The Taxidermist's Daughter that I've discovered that my sisters were terrified of the museum. They really hated it. And so when I went to find the museum, when I started to write Taxidermist's Daughter, I wanted to go and look at it. I got off the train in Arundel because it's much better when you're researching to walk, because you see stuff. You know, don't drive in your car and then get out with a notepad. Try and walk it. So I got off the train. As you know, the station is you know, in the Isle of Wight, really, in Arundel. And so I started walking up towards there. And I walked unerringly up the high street and went into where I knew the museum had been. And I said, I'd love to look around. This is Walter Potter's museum. And they said, no, it isn't. And then the man next door, who I noticed had a stuffed squirrel in the window, told me that that indeed had been a sweet shop. And then I discovered that because my sisters hated it so much, my parents took them to the sweet shop, and I was left alone to go and look at stuffed animals. And so this is part of folk tale and folk memory as well, that my memory is unerringly right, but completely wrong. So I'd gone there, and then I found this place, and of course it was tiny. But what Walter Potter did that was different from any other Victorian taxidermist is that he told stories. So rather than just stuffing animals, he put them into tableaux, these glass cases that told, for example, the story of the original death and burial of Cock Robin. And those of you who know that folk song will know that it goes, the birds of the air fell a-sighing and a-sobbing when they heard of the death of poor Cock Robin. And in the glass case, every single bird that's mentioned is there doing the thing that they talked about in the song. And I thought it was beautiful. And then there were other things that I can see were a little odder. So, for example, the kitten's wedding. So a collection of stuffed kittens, all in wedding clothes, with little earrings on their little ears. No, I won't dwell on the taxidermy. But what is important about it for me is that I never thought these are ex-animals, to quote the Monty Python sketch, this is an ex-parrot. I never looked at them and thought these things were alive and now they're dead and isn't that awful. What I saw was no different to the cuddly toys I picked up at home with my sisters and made talk and move. Because stories come in any form. And so for me, that's sort of all of that collection, which was inspired entirely by rhymes and folk tales and Sussex tales, because he was a Sussex man to his bones, Walter Potter, that I understood that he was telling stories in a different way. And I learnt something there, although I didn't know I was learning it, of course. So when I came back to the idea of writing a Gothic thriller, of course, once I had the creepy house, and then the even creepier house on the other side of the creek in Appledram. And Fishbourne people do come up to me, I'm afraid, and say, I'm really glad you put all the really nasty stuff in Appledram. And I said, I know, as a tribute to my parents, I feel that I can't besmirch Fishbourne's reputation. So all of these things came together to write Taxidermist's Daughter. But as I started to write it, it was a great joy to be able to animate it from here. So the office that one of the baddies is in is my dad's office, where his solicitor's firm used to be. When they're walking up the hill, Love Lane, as College Lane used to be called, I will leave it to your imaginations to imagine why that would be. Suffice to say, no street lamps. Of course, I want my character, as they walk up the hill, of course they look to the right and see the incredible wisteria on these beautiful old buildings here. And then, of course, they keep going, and it was just after Graylingwell had opened, and local people have, an affection for Graylingwell and are proud of the name. That wonderful moment when they tried to call it some other poncy nonsense, and everybody in Chichester went, no, this is fine. But it was exemplary in the day. And I spent a lot of time in the archive office, being helped by all sorts of people, in particular Catherine Slay, who got me the maps of the creek in 1912, and got me all the Walter Potter brochures that are still there, and showed me pictures of West Street and North Street and South Street in that time. So I could look and see. So then, next to what is now the Christian bookshop, was the butcher. And then there was an old tavern that was very famously, where people would go to, continue drinking, shall we say. And you'll be surprised to know, ladies and gentlemen, don't put this on the internet, that there was always a fight at the Globe. I rest my case. But even in those days, it was, So for me, as a Chichesterian, mapping what Chichester in 1912 was like was extraordinary. The final thing I'll say about writing the novel, before I throw it open to questions, is that it is a very peculiar thing to write a novel that is so deeply rooted in home. And not just home then, but home now. And it did feel quite inhibiting, actually. Because in Carcassonne, even though I'm writing real history, and even though we live there part of the time, or used to, it's not my history. But Chichester is my history. And that felt very strange. So as I was trying to choose what to put in and what not to put in, there were certain things that I backed away from, and other things that I became very fascinated by. And the thing I became particularly fascinated by was And I rather love Chichester for it. But reading the Chichester Observer, all the back issues, which I did, you would not know a wider world existed. It was quite astonishing that when I was reading the Chichester Observers of 1912, and it was published on Wednesdays then, not Thursdays. These are the tiny things you discover, and it's very funny. But obviously, the Titanic set sail a few weeks earlier from Southampton. Not a mention of it. Not any mention, even 3 weeks afterwards. The thing that made me giggle, as I grew up in Fishbourne, was so many references in Fishbourne, in the parish notices as well, of, oh God, such and such found another bloody Roman pot. Bang, over the shoulder it goes. Nobody had any idea, but loads of references. Oh, there's another tile. It's very annoying. We're trying to till the field. And it's a lovely thing now, looking back on it, and knowing that in the 60s, of course, this would be discovered, and they would excavate it, and it is the most important domestic dwelling, Roman dwelling, in the country. But then you see lots of mentions, and on the maps of 1912 of Fishbourne, there are things like pot discovered here, arrowhead discovered here, and it clearly just annoyed everybody. And there was no sense that they were sitting on this incredible thing. And these are the things that come out of landscape and writing about home. And the final thing I'm going to say was that when I first published Labyrinth, I was really, really worried about what people in Carcassonne would think. I thought that they would be thinking a real cheek that an Englishwoman had had the temerity to go to their hometown, adopt it, and then write their history. And I was very worried about this, how France would react to it. And after a while, it was clear that French people were buying lots of copies of Labyrinth, and it didn't seem to be a problem with that. So I got bold enough to ask, and had this very interesting answer. And I said to one woman, I said, I'm so glad that you love the book so much, because I was very worried that you would think, everybody local would think that an Englishwoman shouldn't be writing this history. She looked at me and said, better an Englishwoman than a Parisian. I know what she meant. But actually, it was that sense of, history that people don't know. And what I did feel when I was writing, I very, very much, particularly because it is a Gothic thriller, and Gothic writing is bloody and violent. I mean, it makes the stuff that's published now look positively tame. Those of you who have read any Gothic fiction, it is, it's blood and gore from start to finish, really, even though it ends okay. But I was worried about what people here would think about it. And I tried to work out what that was. And of course it was because any story that you tell of your own upbringing, this is nothing to do with me. This is a story based where I grew up, a place where I was and am very happy. That story, the childhood story, the landscape, the folklore, if you will, is not just mine. It is my sister's and my friends and my parents and everybody else's. And so I realised that that was what it was. It was the sense that would they enjoy the book as a book? And it turns out they did. So that's a relief. So I'm now going to take a swig of water, and I'm going to take some questions. We have time for some questions. And those of you who are writers, if you want to ask questions about writing, you're very welcome to do so, or anything to do with, anything really. But as you can see, I'm not that Kate Mosse, so don't ask me about Pete Doherty, because that is very boring on the telephone. So, right, has anybody got a question? Gentleman there, thank you.
In your previous novels, history played an important part, and the characters mixing with history. In The Taxidermist's Daughter, I felt that the setting almost became a character in and of itself.
Thank you.
It was very so atmospheric that you felt it couldn't be set anywhere else. Was that an intentional thing? And if so, at what point did you plan that?
Thank you. The question, very nice compliment, but that in my adventure books, the history is is the key thing. But in Taxidermist's Daughter, it's sort of atmosphere and the landscape, and it almost becomes a character. Truthfully, I would say that landscape is a character in all of my novels. But I believe absolutely that a story can only be set where it's set. So you're completely right. the story of the taxidermist daughter only exists because I love the Fishbourne Marshes. I couldn't write that story set anywhere else because that story belongs to Fishbourne. And I know that about my writing. With Carcassonne, it's exactly the same for Labyrinth. For Sepulchre, it was being in Rennes-les-Bains, and I thought that. With one of my short novels, The Winter Ghosts, which is my only novel that has a male protagonist, a male hero, the others all have female heroes. It was being in a place called Tarascon, and I'd never been there in the summer, but when I was there in the winter, I'd always been surprised that a story set there hadn't come to me. And then I went there in the winter, and immediately it was, oh, it's a winter story, that's why. So you're absolutely right. The place always comes first. And with The Taxidermist Daughter, the thing that's different about it, and it's been a very interesting experience for me because I'm seen as a commercial writer, by which they mean I sell copies, rather than win prizes. That I don't normally, reviews are not terribly much part of my writing need. But with this, I've had the best reviews of my career. And I think it's because it was just imagination. In the end, it was just me standing there saying, okay, Connie, you need to come and show me who you are now. And then once you're here, I can write the story. Because I knew that she would be a young woman in her 20s. I knew she had a father who was alcoholic. He had to be alcoholic because if you're alcoholic and you can't be a taxidermist, because it's incredibly skilled. And so then, women weren't allowed to be taxidermists before the First World War. Who can imagine why, but that was something. So then she has to be working in secret, which means she is isolated, which means the story works. Because if she's happy in a family with lots of friends and all the rest of it, when she says, I'm pretty sure there's somebody out there looking in at the house, people go, come on then, we'll go and have a look. And there is no novel. So all of the ways that you work a novel are about that, okay? You have to explain how it would do. But for this, it was purely standing in Fishbourne and going, bring it on. And then writing that story and writing it faster than I've written anything. And the challenge for me, going back to my big history books, is to keep that, I think, both the atmosphere and that pace. When you, sometimes with history, you feel you've got two hands on your ankles, because of course you have to keep going back to it. So it was both conscious and unconscious. My niece Bryony.
I'm lost now because I don't have the guts to ask you in your book much. When you were talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and playing God, thinking to your book, do you think it's right to preserve life, or do you think it is? Do you think it's unnatural and you should just let bodies decay?
Well, that is a question I'm going to answer at dinner later, because this is utterly no. I think, but I know what. You're right to pull me back to that question about the moral question at the heart of Frankenstein. And the thing I didn't, I suppose, say about Taxidermist's Daughter, and there is an element of playing God in that, because it is, the judgment made, who lives and who doesn't live. The moral question in Taxidermist's Daughter, oddly, isn't playing God in the same way. It is the nature of revenge. And the question is that I'm asking. I'm not asking it. I want you all to read it incredibly fast and go, whoa, that was great. I don't want you to know, this is an interesting moral question, because if you're thinking that, then I have failed. But afterwards, I would like this to come into people's minds, and this came out of absolutely the research in the newspapers. We know these things. There were a lot of cases in the papers in the 1912 Chi Observer of poor, unprotected, working class girls being abused by men in power. We know these things went on, and they go on still. It is, So the question I was asking, if something terrible had happened to you in that sort of way, and you had no redress under the law, so you would never have justice, and also you might never recover, because the people making the judgment were the men who ran the law, the medicine, Graylingwell, then what do you do? Is it ever justified to take revenge if there will be no justice for you? And if it is justified to take revenge, how much is too much? So that is my moral question at the heart of that, rather than should you play God or not. But we will discuss that later with a glass of wine.
I've just reread Labyrinth, and for the second time, and loved it even more.
Thank you.
What fascinates me about it, because I've always been very interested in covers.
I know, I'm so sorry. It'd be much easier if it was at the back, but thank you for coming. No, you don't have to apologise, madam. I hope it gets better. Sorry.
Yes, so, and you obviously have this feeling of steps that have been put on the land before. You go to Carcassonne, and like you said, you've never been there before. It's not your town, it's not your country. But what comes over to me in Labyrinth is there's something there that you recognise. And there's this feeling of you're exploring this thing of past lives, and I wondered how much of that is in your makeup.
Yeah.
Because I found it, and when you went there, logically you were saying, no, I don't recognise that it's not your town, but something inside you knew it. Now, is this my imagination?
No, it's not your imagination. It's this question of past lives and what you recognise, and the Cathars, who are a group of, as I said, heretical so-called Christians, who were mostly in France. There were some in Lombardy, north of Italy, and in other places, and there were various versions through Middle Europe and on, so the Waldensians and the Bogomils and down towards that part of the world. They believed in reincarnation. It was a very distinguishing, it was one of the reasons that they were deemed heretics, of course. And when you're a novelist, as opposed to a non-fiction writer when you're writing a piece of history, in an odd sort of way, it's the same when people ask me if I believe in ghosts. And I always say that's not the right question. Because as a novelist, what I'm doing is asking the question, not answering it. So when I was writing Labyrinth, I knew that Cathars believed absolutely in reincarnation, and that when everybody had been reincarnated in a good way, they'd become better people. They didn't believe in hell. There was no concept. This was hell. They were dualist Christianity, so they believed that God was in heaven and the devil ruled the earth. And it's a very appealing theology in many, many ways, because the idea is that you do your best. And it isn't based on punishment and, whatever. The punishment is to be reincarnated. So this was fundamental. So when I'm writing, what I'm doing is making sure that my characters believe that absolutely.
Yes,
do you see what I mean? So, but what I do feel, and you could say this is to do with reincarnation, this is to do with ghosts, to do with, again, certainly my love of folklore, the idea that in many of those tales lies an element of truth. Do I believe that people leave an imprint on the earth? Yes, actually. Do I believe that I'm recently bereaved of my mother as well as my father. Everybody in this room probably will have lost somebody. And the question is, do they feel gone? Well, of course they are gone. But actually when I'm walking on the Fishbourne marshes, they're not gone. Now, you can say that that's just memory, and scientists would say that's memory. Other people would say it's heart. Other people would say that there is an imprint that will always slightly be there. If we were in Nigeria talking to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie or Ben Okri, they would say, because it is part of that particular Nigerian folklore tradition, that all the ghost spirits are around you all the time. And I always say to Chimamanda, that sounds awful, like permanent sort of yakking. Yeah, so that is it for me. It's more that sense of, in the land, the stories are held.
Yes.
And so when I walk in a wood in the southwest of France, when I walk in Kingly Valley, I feel part of a continuum of humanity, if you like. It sounds a bit highfalutin, but that is what I feel. I can imagine the people who went along this path before, and they're not entirely gone. And I like the idea that when I am long gone, that maybe there'll be that same sort of shimmer, if you like. So it's that I suppose animates me. The spirit of place animates me. And that is in all of my novels, I would say.
It comes over very strongly.
Thank you. Jeremy.
Without giving too much away,
Yep.
the opening scene in the Taxidermist revolves around this church at midnight.
Yeah, Fishbourne Church.
Fishbourne Church. And a flock of birds
Yeah.
appearing. Was that from your imagination, or was that a story that was in folklore somewhere? Or?
Thank you. Yes, there are birds that appear. Yes. Actually, that moment of what happens, that is my imagination. I just suddenly thought, oh my God, that would be really striking. But the whole of the first scene in the prologue comes from a wonderful piece of folklore that I came across in one of those books of old Sussex and all of this thing about the Eve of St. Mark, and the idea of standing that people believed, certainly in the Victorian times, people went, and it was more a working class belief than a whole society belief, but believed that if you went and stood on the Eve of St. Mark, 24th of April, at midnight, you would see the ghosts of those destined to die going into the church. And that really intrigued me. And so I then thought, well, how many of the people in 1912 would really believe that? Most of them probably not, but some might. And then, of course, it means that everybody's facing the door. So other stuff can go on, nobody's looking in that direction. But then I felt there needs to be something. Now, the folklore of birds is very important through the book. I love birds. I have learnt, I've got so many books, so many pairs of binoculars. I still can recognise a blackbird and a robin. I just can't learn birds, but I love birds. And I had always loved particularly the collective nouns for birds are the best collective nouns of all. So obviously through the book, the birds that I've concentrated on, because it's a Gothic novel, are corvids. So I start with jackdaws, who are at the bottom of that pecking order, and then I move up to magpies, and then to rooks, and then to crows. And so I was having fun with, the murder of crows and the collective nouns. My favourite, incidentally, is an incantation of nightingales. An incantation, but I unfortunately have no nightingales, because this is a dark book, not a nice one. So I suppose I had, in the sense that bird mythology, even though I wasn't going to use that much of it, because, as we all know with folklore, a little of it goes quite a long way. Otherwise it becomes quite contrived. You get caught up by it rather than being able to interpret. So I suddenly thought, what I need at that moment, as the bell stops tolling, is something that is actually not frightening at all, but is profoundly shocking. And that's why I did it like that. And those of you who have read it will know that there is a benign version of that at the very end of the book. And so for me, that sort of mythology of birds, what they mean. And still, we all know that rhyme. Everybody, even if they say they're not superstitious at all, does that. My mother, till her dying day, saluted if she saw a single magpie. Always did it. And so do I. And so do my sisters. I always go, good morning, Mr. Magpie. And people are like, what are you doing? So that sort of thing, I like playing with that in the book. But there's a lot of folklore that all of us in this room, because we know we love folklore and we think it matters, and that there is a truth often about history. Sometimes history and folklore are the same. It's just that one group of people decided that these things were serious and decided that these things weren't. So a lot of what is country stories are not seen as history, but they are. So that was what I was trying to do with that, just sort of seeing the bird mythology through the book. And it was also very interesting seeing the absolute inaction derivation of what a pecking order is. We all use the phrase pecking order, but to actually, when I was doing it, my lovely, I think of him as my son-in-law, my daughter's partner, built me a wooden bird table and put it right outside my study window to make the birds come. My mum was furious because she really hated birds. But it meant I watched this happen. The jackdaws come, but if a magpie comes, the jackdaw withdraws. If a rook comes, the magpie withdraws, all the way to the crows. The pecking order works. And so again, that's what I use that in the plot as sort of an escalation, that by the time we're looking at crows, you're in for trouble. We've got time for one more question or another. If anybody has one. Lady there and then Philip. I'll be brief answer.
You've talked a lot about landscape and thinking about the story as a whole. Can you say how that developed in your mind? Did you know what was going to happen at the end? Did you have the whole thing in your mind when you were actually writing?
Thank you. About the plot developing. What I No, I never know. With the real history, I have the spine of the history, so I know that period of history. So I knew that in Citadel, for example, it would end up with the day that all of the Carcassonne resistance were executed, because that was the arc I was following. With Taxidermist's Daughter, I had a really strong image of the last chapter. I knew, back to the rock and the hard place, I knew that it would be on the seawall is going to crack, the flood is coming. This book is basically a cross between Mill on the Floss and Psycho. I mean, that's it. So I had that in my mind, but I didn't know who would be on the wall, and I didn't know why she would be running from that person or towards that person. And it's just now having the great privilege of being a full-time writer for 10 years. So you get better, and you learn to trust your instincts. And so I now know that if I build the stage set and I've got an idea for a story and I let my lead character come to me rather than trying to force it by deciding that she might have brown hair or pink hair, I know the sort of young woman Connie is, but I don't know her. I now know that if I start writing with a sense of a story, the story will come. And so the first chapter of that is Connie doing a bit of taxidermy. When I the first draft, that was about chapter 7. And then, of course, when I looked at it, I thought, this is silly. We haven't started with the lead character. But I wasn't ready to write that chapter. So that's where the editing comes in, that you just, Philippa knows, because she's a writer, you splurge it out, you get to the end, because until you've finished, you don't know what sort of book you might have. And in the edit, you start to move the chapters around, and then I do a third draft. Because once I know the order they're in, and I know the characters. So, for example, a little character boy came into it, a guy called Davy, who's 12, and I had no intention of writing a 12-year-old boy. But of course, as I was writing, I realised, well, she's a middle-class woman. She was already isolated by virtue of her father being, a rather disgraced person. But she's still middle class and still is keeping a sort of veneer of respectability. So she can't be creeping about the churchyard at night. But I need someone to creep about the churchyard at night. Okay, who is the sort of person who would be not noticed in a churchyard at night? Well, a neglected child. So often that's how the story develops. So the story tells me what I need, and then characters come in. And as I was writing, I became very fond of Connie, and I suddenly thought, it'd be quite nice if she had a chap. Now, I never write love stories, so I don't normally think that. So then suddenly Harry was there, and then I realised, of course, that works, because Harry and Connie are parallel. They both have fathers that are of concern to them. They both have things that they want to do but are not allowed to do. Her by virtue of being a woman, and him because his father won't let him go off and be an artist. She is an artist because she does the taxidermy in secret, and he is a painter. And I knew that a great watercolourist, Arthur Evershed, lived in Fishbourne, and he was a medic till he retired, and then became, chairman of this and chairman of that. Was an incredibly important painter, or engraver. I don't know the exact what he put on his tombstone. So then I knew that, of course, he could be going to see him. And so that's how it works when you're plotting. It's the needs of the story to take things forward. And I never know where I'm going to end up. And I also didn't really know what the crime was going to be, and I didn't really know who was going to have done it. I just thought, I'm going to go and see what happens. That's what happened. Philippa, last question.
You've actually kind of answered,
good, well,
answered
perfect.
it. It was about editing. Having written it so fast, how do you edit it?
Well, I mean, actually, it's the whole thing took 5 months from start to finish, which is astonishing, because normally my books take years to research and then to write. But it did what I wanted, which is that I love writing, but my big projects take a lot of time and a lot of emotional energy as well as creative energy. So I was just having a bit of fun. And obviously it is deeply concerning to everybody who knows me that a bit of fun is a serial killer novel. And also anybody who knows, a lot of people have said, you always seem so cheerful. It's a bit worrying you're sitting there thinking that. I said, I'm not sitting there thinking that, I'm writing that. So it's that. But I think that's the thing. And so, to finish, the next thing, I am back in the archive, about to begin the new series of novels, which are big history books. It's a trilogy. For the first time, I'm writing a trilogy rather than writing 3 books that then get put together. It's a Romeo and Juliet story, but family Romeo and Juliet, set in the French Wars of the Religion. It's Huguenots. And it's set in the southwest of France and then the middle of France. And then the next one is set in the north of France and Amsterdam. And the last one is set in Amsterdam and South Africa, where some of the Huguenots went. So that we're doing that. And the other thing that some people wanted to know is about film. And we've just delivered the film screenplay for The Winter Ghosts, which my husband and I have written together, and we're going to start filming next year, which is great. And we are writing the screenplay now for Taxidermist's Daughter. So we will see where we get with that, because yes, it'll be fun. Yeah, Lady Bear.
I just think you might want to advertise the course that I'm coming to on December the 12th.
What course is that?
It's you and Greg doing something for The Guardian.
Oh, The Guardian, yes. I don't want to do that because it's sold out. But anyway, but thank you. Thank you for that anyway.
Can I make one quick comment?
Absolutely. The microphone is yours, sir.
One thing that many people may not know about you, I can get from any subject to Robert Louis Stevenson in one move. You did an introduction to Treasure Island.
I did.
That struck me very much when you were talking earlier about storytelling, and you came out with the idea of it went right back to people sitting around a campfire. He has exactly that idea, and it linked to the place of storytelling in fiction, which in many ways is rather looked down on. You know, this sort of
Yes.
wash on. But you said you're a commercial writer, you
Yeah.
tell stories. I wondered how that connected to the growth currently of storytelling groups, because when you read your own work, there was effectively storytelling, and it was brilliant. And it's a different sort of thing from sitting reading a
Yes.
book. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons that a lot of people are in book groups, because I think the joy of listening to work read out loud, not reading the whole thing, but just reading bits out and things, I think is really fantastic. And I think that sort of sense of the value of storytelling. Storytelling is what I feel as a novelist, that when I write a novel, it's finished and I put it there and it belongs as much to the reader as to me. And that, of course, is the great tradition of ghost stories. M.R. James, Blackwood, Lovelock, Lovecraft, all of these people. Is that M.R. James' ghost stories came absolutely that every Christmas Eve he stood by the mantelpiece. Obviously, Poirot was not yet invented, at King's College, Cambridge, and then at Eton, and spoke aloud a ghost story. And I really enjoyed that, and I think that there is a resurgence of that, actually, understanding that to hear a story is really fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. Thank No, you're quite right. I just like the story I know. That's where I like Hello. Oh, thank you. That's very nice.
You read her books? You read her books?
Right, How funny, so what's your name? Well, that's lovely too. No, I haven't. Oh, lovely. Oh, dear. Thank you. Oh, good. That's really good. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Right past. That's all right.
Oh,